Hello, my dear masterminds. You never changed for them. You just stopped hiding who you really were. And the moment that happened, the entire atmosphere around you shifted, because for a long time, they were comfortable with the version of you that stayed quiet, the version that played small, the version that made everyone else feel safe by never fully stepping into your own power. They didn't mind you when you were shrinking yourself to fit into rooms that were too small for your spirit. They didn't mind you when you softened your edges, lowered your voice, muted your instincts, and acted like you didn't see what was really going on. They mistook your patience for weakness. They mistook your restraint for fear. They mistook your silence for permission. But what they never understood was that you were never hiding because you were unsure. You were hiding because you were waiting for timing, waiting for clarity, waiting for the moment when pretending would feel more painful than standing in your truth. And when that moment arrived, you didn't announce it. You didn't ask for understanding. You didn't explain yourself. You just stopped performing. You stopped diluting your thoughts. You stopped negotiating your identity. You stopped bending to expectations that were built for someone you were never meant to be. And that's when everything changed. People started reacting differently. Conversations shifted. Energy shifted. Some people got uncomfortable. Some people got quiet. Some people got defensive. Some people walked away, because the truth is, the real you doesn't need approval. And that unsettles people who were only comfortable with your limits. You didn't become arrogant. You became aligned. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You didn't become distant. You became selective. And that level of self-honesty disrupts everything it touches. It exposes dynamics that were built on imbalance. It dissolves patterns that depended on your compliance. It rewrites rules that only worked when you stayed unaware of your own worth. The reason they say you changed is because the old version of you was convenient. The real version of you is uncontrollable. And when someone steps into that kind of self-recognition, the world either adjusts or resists. There is no middle ground. You didn't betray who you were. You returned to who you always were before the world told you to be smaller. And that return, that's what they're reacting to. The wildest part is this: the moment you stopped hiding, they finally saw what was there all along. Not a new version of you, but the unfiltered one. And that version didn't just walk into the room, it shifted the entire room's center of gravity. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't demand attention. You didn't try to convince anybody of anything. Your presence alone carried a clarity that made every mask in front of you feel heavier. And that's why they started scrambling. Because people who benefited from your silence call your authenticity a challenge. People who relied on you dimming your light call your confidence changing. People who expected you to shrink call your growth distance. But deep down, they know exactly what happened. You reclaimed your narrative. You reclaimed your tone. You reclaimed your intuition, the one they always underestimated, even when it was the sharpest thing in the room. And when someone stands in that kind of truth, it rearranges the entire social landscape. You'll notice how suddenly the wrong ones fall back. They don't drift, they drop, because the real you doesn't validate their illusions anymore. You'll notice how the right ones lean in, not because you've become someone else, but because you finally became visible to those who are aligned with your real frequency. And somewhere in between those exits and entrances, you'll realize how much energy you wasted protecting identities that were never yours. You were never meant to play small so others could feel big. You were never meant to apologize for traits that were actually your gifts. You were never meant to shrink to match rooms that weren't designed for your spirit. That's why your evolution looks like rebellion to people who were attached to your limits. And that's why your honesty looks like disruption to people who relied on your silence. What they call you changing is just you waking up. What they call you acting different is just you reclaiming pieces of yourself they weren't supposed to hold. They didn't lose you. They lost access to the version of you that was never sustainable. And that loss feels like chaos to them, because the real you doesn't orbit their expectations anymore. They don't get to decide your tone. They don't get to define your worth. They don't get to frame your story. You're writing your own script now, and the pen is finally in the right hands, yours. And now they're sitting with the consequences of finally seeing you clearly. Something that demands isolation, observation, and transformation. And while they were out there, assuming your story was already written, you were learning to hold a pen they didn't think you'd ever pick up. You studied yourself. You confronted your shadows. You broke out of loops they didn't even know you were trapped in. They thought the silence around you meant stagnation. It meant preparation. Every time life pressed you with something heavy, you didn't crumble. You recalibrated. They saw pauses. You were downloading an entirely new system, and now your presence holds a gravity they can't replicate. They don't understand how you became so steady, so certain, so self-defined. But the truth is simple. Certainty grows when you stop betraying your own instincts. Strength arrives when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never trying to understand you. Power unlocks when you stop performing versions of yourself for acceptance. You didn't grow louder, you grew grounded. You didn't get colder, you got precise. You didn't become distant, you became intentional about what deserves access to you. And that level of alignment unsettles people who are comfortable with you being uncertain, because uncertainty is controllable. Alignment isn't. They can't push your buttons the same way anymore, because you moved the control panel inside. They can't predict your reactions because you're not reacting, you're choosing. They can't corner you with expectations because you no longer need to be seen a certain way to feel valid. And that's the part they struggle to accept the most. The new you isn't fueled by proving anything. The new you isn't driven by comparison. The new you doesn't need to be right in their eyes because you're finally right within yourself. And when someone reaches that level of self-trust, their entire presence changes. Their posture changes. Their patience changes. Their decisions change. Their silence changes. It's no longer empty, it's charged. It's no longer passive, it's deliberate. It's no longer fear, it's focus. That's why they keep misinterpreting you now. They think you're distant when you're actually centered. They think you're detached when you're actually disciplined. They think you've changed when you've actually stabilized. The version of you they miss was the version that doubted itself. The version you've become is the one that listens to itself. And there is no going back from that. Once you realize your power doesn't need permission, you stop asking. Once you realize your truth doesn't require approval, you stop explaining. Once you realize your presence doesn't need validation, you stop seeking. And that's when the world truly begins to adjust around you. Not because you demanded it, but because alignment always reshapes its surroundings. They keep replaying old versions of you in their minds, trying to figure out where the shift happened, trying to pinpoint the exact moment you changed. as if transformation is a single event instead of a slow burn that happens in private. They don't see the process. The nights you chose discipline over distraction. The moments you swallowed your reactions and sharpened your awareness instead. The internal victories that never made noise. All they see is the result. And results always confuse people who ignored the process. You didn't wake up powerful one day. You trained your mind to stop folding under pressure. You trained your emotions to stop controlling your direction. You trained your focus to stop scattering every time someone doubted you. That's what they're sensing now, the weight of someone who has already faced themselves and survived. The reason your presence feels heavier to them is because it's anchored. You're no longer floating between identities. You're no longer apologizing for your intensity. You're no longer smoothing your edges so others can stay comfortable. And comfort was the only leverage they ever had over you. Once you took that away, once you stopped cushioning your truth, the entire dynamic flipped. Now they're cautious with their words. Now they measure their behavior around you. Now they wonder what you see that you're not saying. They feel observed without being watched. They feel evaluated without being judged. Because your awareness is quiet but direct, you don't need to confront when your clarity already speaks for you. You don't need to dominate when your steadiness already sets the tone. You don't need to announce strength when your boundaries already enforce it. That's why they feel unsettled. They were familiar with the version of you that negotiated with uncertainty. They don't recognize the version of you that doesn't negotiate with misalignment at all. This version walks away without drama. This version chooses silence without fear. This version selects peace without guilt. And that kind of self-command isn't loud. It's undeniable. It shifts rooms. It recalibrates conversations. It forces people to either rise or retreat. There is no comfortable middle anymore. You didn't outgrow people because you thought you were better than them. You outgrew them because you stopped being smaller than yourself. And that difference is everything. They can call it pride. They can call it distance. They can call it change. But you know what it really is. It's the moment you decided that self-respect was no longer optional. And once that decision is made, the world has no choice but to respond accordingly. And now you see it clearly. The way the world rearranges itself when you stop pretending to be less than you are. You feel it in the pauses between conversations. You notice it in the hesitation behind certain smiles. You sense it in the way some people suddenly don't know where they stand with you anymore. That confusion isn't weakness on their part. It's the shock of realizing they no longer control the version of you they once understood. You used to be predictable to them. You used to be readable. You used to be someone they could label quickly and place comfortably inside their expectations. That illusion is gone now. And when illusions dissolve, people scramble quietly before they ever react openly. They're not afraid of you. They're uneasy with what your awakening represents. What your confidence reflects about their hesitation. What your boundaries reveal about their habits. What your growth exposes about their stagnation. You didn't become intimidating. You became self-directed, and self-directed people can't be steered, guilted, pressured, or manipulated the way they once could. That's why the air feels different now. You don't argue the way you used to. You don't explain the way you used to. You don't chase clarity the way you used to. You already have it. And clarity changes everything. It changes how you speak. It changes how you listen. It changes how you wait. It changes how you choose. You don't rush to prove yourself. because you're no longer negotiating your value. You don't rush to defend yourself because you've already accepted who you are. And that internal acceptance is louder than any external approval ever could be. They try to test you now in subtle ways, small comments, slight shifts, quiet challenges, to see if the old version still exists somewhere they can reach. But every time they test, they get the same result: composure, discernment, distance. Not coldness, control, not arrogance, certainty. And that unsettles them more than confrontation ever would, because confrontation gives them something familiar to push against. Your calm gives them nothing to grab. You've become unhookable, unbotherable, unreadable in the ways that used to make you vulnerable. And in that unreadability, you've found a new kind of freedom. You're no longer reacting to every ripple. You're deciding which waves deserve your attention. You're no longer adjusting your identity to fit rooms that don't deserve your presence. You're selecting your environments with intention. And intention is the difference between drifting through life and commanding your direction. They feel that shift in you, even if they can't name it. They feel the way you're no longer available to dynamics that once drained you. They feel the way you no longer bend to emotional pressure. They feel the way you don't need to be seen to feel solid. And that realization quietly rearranges the hierarchy in every room you enter. And now everything makes sense to you in a way it never did before. The tension you used to feel in certain rooms, the subtle resistance you couldn't explain, the strange pull toward growth that never let you stay comfortable for long. You weren't losing people. You were outgrowing versions of yourself that could no longer carry where your life was headed. That's the truth. They're only now starting to feel. The reason your presence feels different isn't because you're trying to dominate anything. It's because you're no longer hiding the authority you always had over your own direction. You're no longer asking life what you're allowed to become. You're deciding. And decision is the moment power becomes real. They keep calling it change because they need a word that makes your evolution feel temporary. But this isn't a phase. This is alignment. This is what happens when someone finally stops splitting themselves into acceptable pieces for other people's comfort. This is what happens when self-respect outweighs social approval. This is what happens when instinct finally outranks insecurity. You didn't wake up one morning and become someone else. You remembered who you were before the world taught you to hesitate. And that remembrance is irreversible. They sense it now, in the way you don't rush your answers, in the way you don't chase attention, in the way you don't compete for validation. You've stepped into a frequency that doesn't beg to be heard, it just is. And anything that doesn't resonate with it naturally falls out of range. That's why people are reacting without knowing why. That's why dynamics are shifting without discussion. That's why certain doors are closing without argument while new ones open without effort. You didn't force these outcomes. You aligned with yourself, and alignment did the rest. They can say you're different. They can say you changed. They can say you're not the same anymore. And they're right about one thing. You're not the same. You're clearer. You're steadier. You're no longer divided between who you are and who you pretend to be. The old you needed reassurance. The new you carries certainty. The old you hesitated to take space. The new you knows exactly when to step in and when to walk away. And the most important shift, you stopped waiting to be chosen and chose yourself first. That's the shift that rearranges everything. They didn't lose you because you became distant. They lost the version of you that made their comfort easier than your truth. You didn't change for them. You simply stopped hiding for them. And that decision didn't just reveal who you are. It revealed who was never meant to walk with you into this next chapter. And here's the part they don't know how to process yet. The version of you standing here now is only the beginning of what happens when someone finally stops negotiating with their own truth. This chapter you're in isn't the peak, it's the foundation. Everything you stripped away, every illusion you dropped, every mask you retired, that was preparation. The old you survived confusion. The new you moves with direction. The old you asked questions. The new you is the answer. They will keep trying to understand what shifted, when it shifted, how it happened. They will keep studying your tone, your silence, your choices, your stillness. But they won't find a single moment. They'll only find a pattern of discipline, self-honesty, and quiet decisions that added up to something they can't reverse. Because this kind of evolution doesn't announce itself with noise. It announces itself with permanence. You are no longer becoming, you are being, and the energy of being is unstoppable. Rooms will feel smaller to you now. Conversations will feel slower. Excuses will sound louder. Because once your inner world sharpens, everything external becomes more obvious. You'll notice how people reveal themselves without speaking. You'll sense intentions before they're acted on. You'll notice how people reveal themselves without speaking. You'll sense intentions before they're acted on. You'll feel shifts before they happen. Not because you're superior, but because you're aligned. And alignment always looks like awareness to those who are still drifting. They will call you intense, distant, different because they aren't used to someone who means what they say, who restricts access they never earned, who no longer hesitates for their comfort. Let them talk. You didn't come this far to be understood by people who never listened to you when you were still soft. You didn't survive becoming yourself just to dilute it again for comfort. You paid too much to earn this clarity. You walked too far in silence to turn back into noise, and the universe respects that. Opportunity respects that. Life rearranges itself around people who stop lying to themselves. That's why things are opening now without force. That's why paths are aligning without struggle. That's why what once felt heavy is beginning to feel guided. You're not chasing anymore. You're choosing. You're not reacting anymore. You're directing. You're not hiding anymore. You're present. And presence is the rarest form of power. They will remember the old you because it was easier for them. You will honor the new you because it is finally real. And from this point forward, every step you take will feel quieter on the outside and louder in its impact. Because when someone stops hiding who they are, reality has no choice but to respond. Hello, my dear masterminds. Something shifted in the conversations happening around you. Something profound that you might not have fully noticed yet. When people in your field talk about excellence, when they discuss what it means to do things the right way, when they need an example of true professionalism, they don't reference textbooks anymore. They don't cite famous figures from history. They don't point to abstract ideals. They say your name. Your name became the standard, the benchmark, the measuring point by which everything else is evaluated. Not because you campaigned for this position, not because you marketed yourself as the example, but because your consistent excellence, Your steady standards, your undeniable quality created a reality that everyone had to acknowledge. You became the definition of professional simply by being consistently, firmly, authentically excellent. And now there's a before and after in your industry. Before your level and after your level. Before people saw what you made possible, and after they witnessed what you achieved. You didn't just raise the bar. You became the reference point. And everyone else is now reaching for a level you established through nothing more than commitment to your own truth. But here's what most people don't realize about becoming the standard. It doesn't happen through one brilliant moment. It happens through 1,000 consistent choices that nobody sees. It started quietly. Someone, somewhere, was trying to explain what excellence looks like in your field, what real professionalism means, what the gold standard is. And they couldn't find the right words to capture it abstractly. So they said, you know, like what your name does, like how your name handles things. That's the level we're talking about. And it worked. Everyone in the conversation immediately understood, because they'd seen your work, witnessed your approach, observed your standards. Your name carried more clarity than any lengthy explanation could provide. Your example communicated more effectively than any theoretical description. You had become the concrete reference point for an abstract concept. Then it happened again. Different conversation, different people, same reference, like your name. That's what we're aiming for. Your name kept coming up, not as a comparison in the sense of you versus others, but as the definition itself, the embodiment of what professional means in its truest, highest form. You weren't in these conversations, didn't know they were happening, weren't aware that your name had become shorthand for excellence. Think about it. The intern asked what excellent looks like. The team lead said your name. The decision maker asked for the best. The group said your name. Others assessing quality studied your work. You became the answer before anyone finished the question. Your name stopped being just a name. It became a concept, a complete package of qualities that people aspired to embody. When someone said your name in professional contexts, it carried layers of meaning. It meant quality that stays firm, standards that stay consistent, excellence that stays steady, showing up consistently. Not just when it's convenient, not just when you're motivated, but always with the same level of commitment. It meant attention to detail that others considered excessive until they saw the results it produced. The way you didn't skip steps, didn't cut corners, didn't settle for good enough when excellence was possible. Your thoroughness became what others measured their own work against, and often found it lacking. It meant integrity that stayed consistent regardless of circumstances, doing what you said you'd do, honoring commitments even when inconvenient, maintaining your standards even when no one would know if you lowered them. There was probably a moment when you realized what had happened, when someone mentioned to you that you'd become the benchmark, that your name was being used as the definition of professional, that people were aspiring to reach your level. And maybe you felt surprised, because you weren't trying to become anyone's example. You were just being yourself. And here's the paradox that changes everything. The people trying to become the standard rarely do. The people simply being excellent become it without trying. That's exactly how real standards are set. Not by people trying to become examples, but by people so committed to their own excellence that they naturally become examples. not by those seeking to be benchmarks, but by those so focused on their own quality that benchmark status finds them. You weren't performing excellence for an audience, you were living it for yourself. And that authenticity is precisely what made it strong enough to become what everyone else measured themselves against. You might have felt the significance of this realization, the responsibility that comes with being the reference point. Because now people are observing more closely. Now your choices carry additional meaning. Now your standards aren't just yours anymore. They're what others measure themselves against. But you didn't lower your standards to make others comfortable with the comparison, didn't reduce your quality to close the gap. You understood that carrying the standard comes with responsibility. Let's talk about what you actually did that elevated you to this position. Because it wasn't one thing. It was a complete approach, a total commitment, a way of being that shaped everything you did. Here's what separates those who become the standard from those who pursue it. Some deliver excellent work only when it matters. You delivered excellent work even when no one was paying attention. Some were professional when people were watching. You were professional when no one was observing. You treated every task like it mattered. Not just the high visibility work, not just the things people would see. Everything. The small details no one would notice. The behind-the-scenes preparation no one would know about. The foundational work that others skip because it isn't glamorous. You gave equal attention to what was visible and what was invisible because your standard wasn't about appearance, it was about reality. You refused to make excuses. When challenges arose, you found solutions. When obstacles appeared, you navigated them. When circumstances were difficult, you adapted. You didn't spend energy explaining why something couldn't be done. You spent energy figuring out how it could be done. Your results spoke louder than anyone else's explanations. You invested in mastery when others were content with competence. You kept learning when others decided they knew enough. You kept improving when others plateaued. You treated your craft with deep respect. Your profession as a meaningful pursuit. Your work as something that deserved care, and that respect showed in everything you produced. As a result, your baseline became everyone else's peak. Your average became their exceptional. Your consistency became so reliable, it felt ordinary to you even as it remained impressive to others. Your level didn't just affect how people talked about you. It influenced how they approached their own work. Because when the standard rises, everyone either adapts or falls behind. You encouraged growth across your entire field simply by refusing to accept the previous normal as acceptable. People started asking themselves questions they hadn't asked before. If they can do it at that level, why can't I? What would it take for me to reach that level? What habits do I need to change? Your example made average effort uncomfortable, made cutting corners feel noticeable, made half efforts appear insufficient. Some people reacted negatively. They didn't like that you made their previous best look inadequate. They didn't like that expectations rose for everyone, but their reaction didn't change reality. You had redefined what professional looked like, and there was no returning to the old standard. Others were inspired, challenged, motivated. They saw what you achieved and realized it was possible. They observed your consistency and understood it was attainable. They studied your approach and recognized it was learnable. Before you, professional meant meeting basic expectations, showing up on time, following guidelines, doing what was required. But your approach transformed the meaning. Professional became about excellence as a baseline, about quality as a consistent choice, about standards that exceed expectations. Because meeting expectations was never your goal. Professional became about how you handle the unseen parts of your work, the preparation no one witnesses, the practice no one observes, the refinement no one knows about. It became about what you do when no one is watching, because your standard is for you, not for an audience. You maintain it in private so it shows in public. Professional became about integrity in every interaction, not just with influential people or in important moments, with everyone, in every moment. Treating every conversation with respect, every commitment with seriousness, every relationship with care. You demonstrated that professionalism isn't a role you switch on for certain occasions. It's who you are consistently. Professional became about taking responsibility without being asked, about solving problems without being told, about seeing what needs to happen and making it happen without requiring instruction or approval. You showed that real professionals don't wait for direction, they create direction. And here's the daily practice that created this reality. A practice so simple, most people overlook it. So consistent, most people can't maintain it. You start before others start. Not to show off, but because your commitment to excellence requires preparation time that can't be rushed. While others are still getting ready, you're already working. While others are planning to begin, you've already begun. Your early start isn't about competing with others. It's about giving yourself the time quality requires. You finish after others finish, not because you're slow, because you don't cut corners at the end. Don't skip the final touches. Don't settle for almost done. You see, work through to true completion. Polish what others leave rough. Refine what others leave good enough. You double check what others don't check once. Review what others never review. Your attention to accuracy isn't worry, it's professionalism. You invest in your tools, your knowledge, your skills, not occasionally, continuously. You read what others mean to read, practice what others mean to practice, learn what others mean to learn. Your growth isn't something you're planning for tomorrow. It's what you're doing today, every day, without exception. Being the standard can feel isolating because you're no longer operating at the same level as most of your peers. You're in a space that few occupy, working at an intensity few maintain, holding standards few match. And that creates distance, not intentional, but natural. And here's what this experience actually is. It's not rejection. It's the necessary space for mastery, the separation required for deep work, the distance needed to hear your own voice above the noise of collective average thinking. You can't relate to the complaints about how hard it is to maintain basic quality. You can't join conversations about cutting corners to save time. You can't participate in the collective agreement to lower standards when things get difficult, because those aren't your experiences. Those aren't your choices. So you work alone more often, because you need space to maintain your focus. Need an environment that supports your standards. Once you became the reference point, others tried to imitate you, copied your approach, mimicked your style, attempted to reproduce your results, and some got close to the surface, looked similar to you, sounded similar to you, but couldn't match the substance, couldn't replicate the depth, couldn't maintain the consistency. Here's why imitation always falls short. They saw the output, but not the input. The results, but not the process. The achievement, but not the discipline. They wanted your level without your habits, your recognition without your commitment, your status without your substance. You can copy someone's methods. You can't copy their character. And character is what makes the standard sustainable. So those attempts faded. People grew tired of maintaining an appearance that wasn't grounded in reality, returned to their natural level. And you remained consistent, authentic, unchanged by efforts to reach you. Because your standard isn't a performance you put on, it's a reality you live. Being the standard comes with responsibility, not just to maintain your own excellence, but to understand that your choices now influence more than just your outcomes, that your example shapes others. You're responsible for continuing to grow, because if you stop evolving, you become the ceiling. You limit what's considered possible. But if you keep expanding, keep redefining excellence, you continue encouraging progress in others. You're responsible for maintaining integrity even when it costs you, because people are observing, using you as their reference point. If you compromise, you teach them that compromise is acceptable. If you cut corners, you show them corners can be cut. Your choices ripple outward beyond your own work, into the work of others. You're responsible for being gracious about your position, not arrogant, not superior, not dismissive of those still climbing toward your level. You remember being where they are. Remember the work it took to get where you are, and you honor their journey while maintaining your standard. You're the example they're reaching for, not the barrier preventing their progress. Why did your name become the benchmark and not someone else's? You were consistent when others were sporadic. They had moments of brilliance surrounded by periods of average. You had sustained excellence, day after day, week after week, year after year. Consistency isn't exciting, but it's what builds lasting recognition. It's what makes people trust that your quality isn't accidental. It's intentional, reliable, steady. You were authentic when others were performing. They tried to be what they thought professionals should look like. You simply were professional in your own way. You didn't imitate anyone's version of excellence. You created your own, and authenticity resonates deeper than performance. People feel the difference between someone being themselves excellently and someone trying to appear excellent. You were humble about your ability while confident in your standards. You didn't announce being the best. You maintained standards that demonstrated it. You didn't need to declare your excellence. Your work showed it. Your results reflected it. Your consistency confirmed it. And that humility made your confidence clear rather than excessive. You cared more about the work than the recognition, more about the quality than the credit, more about substance than status. And that authentic focus on substance over appearance is what made your excellence real rather than performed, what made your impact steady rather than temporary. Your position isn't temporary. It isn't a title that expires. It's a reality you've created through years of consistency, a reputation built through countless choices, a record you're establishing through steady commitment. Once you become the standard, you remain the standard until someone exceeds you. And exceeding you requires matching your consistency, your quality, your integrity over time. And that isn't easy. That isn't common. That's why you remain the reference point. Even when you step away from active work, your name will remain what people point to. People will say, Remember when your name set that level? Remember what professional meant when they defined it. Your impact outlasts your direct involvement. Your influence extends beyond your day-to-day participation. Your example becomes part of the culture, part of shared memory. So here's the truth. Disciplined individual. Your name became the standard for explaining what professional looks like. Not because you sought this position, but because you earned it through consistent commitment to excellence, through steady demonstration of quality, through maintaining standards that many admire but few sustain. You're no longer measuring yourself against others. You're refining yourself against your own previous best. Because being the standard isn't a destination, it's a commitment to continuous improvement. Others are reaching for the level you maintain, using your name as a reference for what they're trying to become. And that's not ego, that's outcome. That's the natural result of sustained excellence. Hello, my dear masterminds. They walked into that room thinking everything was locked in. Roles assigned, angles calculated, timelines fixed. They had contingency plans inside contingency plans, all built on one quiet assumption that you were just another variable to factor in, not a force that could rewrite the equation. They underestimated the difference between someone who fits into a strategy and someone whose very presence becomes the new strategy. You didn't arrive loud. You didn't storm in with declarations, demands, or performance. You walked in the same way you always do, grounded, unhurried, eyes taking in more than your expression ever reveals. And that alone shifted the temperature. Nobody said it out loud. They just felt it. That tiny pause before continuing their sentence. That subtle shift in their rhythm. That half second where their brain tried to reconcile what they'd prepared for with what they were suddenly feeling. They had spent hours rehearsing positions, rehearsing lines, rehearsing how to steer the narrative. But rehearsals only work on static environments, and you are not static. You are a moving reference point. The moment you sat down, plans that looked foolproof on paper started to feel strangely fragile. Jokes didn't land the same. The loudest voice in the room toned it down a notch. The one who always postures went quieter than usual. No one announced the shift, but everyone felt their internal script slipping. That's the thing about real presence. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force. It doesn't need theatrics. It exposes. It pulls the mask off, forced confidence, and shows who is anchored and who is acting. You didn't even speak at first. You let the room reveal itself. Let them run their playbook at half strength because they could feel you there, watching. Not with judgment, but with a kind of calm that says, I'm not impressed by your performance. I'm measuring the structure underneath it. And that's what unsettled them. They're used to people trying to impress them, convince them, win favor. You didn't try to win anything. You moved like someone who already had something they couldn't name. Suddenly, their clever tactics felt small. Their rehearsed lines felt thin. The very plan they were so proud of now felt like cardboard held up against something made of stone. They didn't know how to explain it, so they didn't. They just kept going, pretending nothing had shifted, while their bodies betrayed them with tense shoulders, hesitant voices, altered breathing. They don't realize it yet, but that was the first moment their plan began rewriting itself around you. Not because you attacked it, Because you showed up anchored in a way that made everything built on insecurity feel unstable. They thought they were walking into a room to manage you. Instead, they walked into a room where your presence quietly started managing them. And that's why, even after everything ended, they went home replaying the scene, wondering why nothing went exactly how they pictured it. They're still processing the part they can't put into words. It wasn't what you did. It was what reality did once you arrived. After you left that room, the real shift didn't happen in public. It happened in private. It happened later, in the quiet spaces where people replay moments they don't understand. That's where their confidence started leaking out in slow, invisible ways. They sat alone with their notes, with their messages, with their carefully written plans. And something felt off, not wrong on the surface, off underneath, like a frequency they couldn't tune back into. They tried to convince themselves it was nothing, just tension, just pressure, just overthinking. But overthinking doesn't make entire strategies suddenly feel outdated. Overthinking doesn't make a room full of experienced minds lose their edge at the same moment. They all felt it, and that's what unsettled them most. Whatever shifted wasn't personal, it was environmental. Their group chats grew quieter. The boldest ones stopped sending confident voice notes and switched to cautious texts. The one who always had the next move ready delayed longer than usual before replying. Tiny things, almost unnoticeable. But momentum is built on tiny things, and theirs had stalled. They started rechecking details they never used to doubt, running scenarios they thought were already solved, looking for gaps that hadn't been there before. That's when the question surfaced. Slowly, reluctantly, in more than one mind. Did we misread them? Not in a dramatic way, in a subtle, professional way, the most dangerous kind. Because once professionals begin to question their read of someone, respect is already forming under the doubt. They realized you hadn't reacted to their energy at all. You hadn't mirrored their tension. You hadn't flinched at their positioning. You hadn't tried to counter their angle. You simply existed inside the situation without surrendering to it. That's when they recognized the imbalance. Everything they prepared for required you to engage emotionally. Their leverage depended on prompting a response. Pressure only works when the other side feels pressed. You didn't. And now they couldn't figure out why. They tried to reconstruct your silence. Was it confidence? Was it restraint? Was it strategy? Or was it something more unsettling? The absence of risk perception altogether. Because people who feel challenged behave in predictable ways. They defend, they over-explain, they posture. You did none of that. You behaved like someone who didn't feel pursued at all. Like someone who didn't recognize their plan as challenging enough to require protection. That realization hit one of them first, quietly. Then it spread, not through announcements, through behavior, through hesitation, through second guessing. They became careful around you without intending to. They stopped speaking recklessly in your orbit. They avoided committing to positions too strongly when your name was nearby. Not because you demanded caution, because their system now associated your presence with unpredictable consequence. And unpredictable consequence is the only thing that truly restrains those who believe they control outcomes. You never confronted their plan head on. You never exposed it. You never challenged it. And that's exactly what makes it unwind. Because plans fall apart fastest when they lose the certainty they're built on. And certainty is the first thing your presence erodes. You didn't rewrite their whole plan in one move. You rewrote the way they felt inside it. And now they're still processing that change, not knowing whether to adapt, retreat, or pretend. Nothing happened. The worst part for them is this. Deep down, they know the next time they face you, they won't be walking in with the same confidence. And once confidence is shaken, every step after that sounds different. What really unsettled them wasn't what you did. It was what you didn't do. They expected a signal, a reaction, a defensive shift, something that would confirm you were inside their game. Instead, you moved like someone operating on a completely different map. That's when discomfort started to turn into quiet obsession. Because when people don't understand your moves, they don't stop watching. You become the move they study. They began reconstructing the moment frame by frame in their minds. The way you paused, the timing of your words, the silence between sentences. They searched for intention inside every micro detail, trying to decode meaning that wasn't meant for them. And the more they analyzed, the more patterns failed. Because your behavior didn't fit their models. It didn't align with ego-driven tactics or fear-based responses. It didn't match dominance plays or submission cues. That's when the quiet realization landed. Their tools weren't built for someone like you. Not because you're louder, not because you're aggressive, but because your presence operates on a different logic entirely. They use pressure to steer outcomes. You use alignment to let outcomes reveal themselves. They try to predict reactions. You move when it's time to move, not when you're tested. That difference is invisible to amateurs, but to strategists, it's destabilizing. They began watching you without knowing what they were looking for. Every interaction became data. Every movement became potential signal. Yet the more they gathered, the less clarity they gained. Because the strongest players don't leave readable trails. They leave effects, and effects only become obvious after they've already spread. Some of them tried to dismiss you to protect their pride, labeled your calm as coincidence, labeled your timing as luck, labeled your silence as passive. But those labels didn't survive contact with reality for long, because outcomes kept quietly tilting in your favor in ways no one could publicly explain. Doors you didn't knock on started opening. Conversations you weren't part of began bending toward your name. Decisions made without your involvement somehow aligned with your long-term advantage. And that's when the concern sharpened. Not panic, not shock, a different kind of concern. The kind that comes from realizing influence doesn't always announce itself. Some power doesn't ask permission. It doesn't posture. It doesn't threaten. It simply rearranges the field while everyone is still arguing about the rules. They started to feel like they were responding to something that had already happened. Like every move they made was one step behind a shift they couldn't locate in time. And that's the moment control truly slips. Not when someone overpowers you, but when you realize the game has been quietly rewritten without consulting you. You didn't need to dominate their plan. You made their plan feel late, and in environments built on timing. Being late is the only mistake you can't recover from. Once that realization settles in, everything about the room changes. The same people who once spoke with certainty start choosing their words more carefully. The same ones who dismissed your presence now measure their tone when your name surfaces. They don't announce the shift. They feel it. Because power doesn't always arrive as a moment. It arrives as pressure in the background, subtle, persistent, unignorable. You didn't confront them, you didn't expose them, you simply moved with a patience that outlived their urgency. And that patience started bending outcomes in ways they couldn't interrupt. They began to notice that every time they rushed, they miscalculated. Every time they tried to force direction, something slipped through their fingers. Meanwhile, you stayed steady. Not stagnant, steady. There's a difference. Stagnation waits. Steadiness advances without noise. And that confused them more than resistance ever could. Because resistance gives them a target. Steadiness removes the arena entirely. They tried to map your intentions through proximity, watched who you spoke to, who stood near you, who left conversations thinking differently than they entered them. But the influence didn't behave like contamination. It behaved like gravity. Silent, constant, directional. You didn't persuade, you aligned. And alignment spreads faster than argument ever could. One by one, small patterns began breaking. A choice someone would have made instantly before now took hesitation. A reaction that used to be automatic now stalled. Their systems were still running, but the software underneath had been quietly edited. That's when they started to feel disoriented. Because nothing was obviously broken, and yet nothing was working the way it used to. You didn't rewrite their rules with confrontation. You exposed the limitations of their rules simply by outgrowing them. Some tried to regain control by accelerating. They rushed decisions to reassert dominance. They overplayed confidence, hoping to silence the doubt creeping into their certainty. But acceleration without clarity only amplifies error. And their errors began stacking in public ways. Meanwhile, your silence grew louder, not because it demanded attention, but because it kept being right. Outcomes kept validating choices you never defended. Paths kept clearing that you never argued for. People who once analyzed you now found themselves adjusting to you without ever agreeing to it. That's the deepest shift of all. When adaptation happens without consent, when alignment occurs without permission, when people begin to move in response to something they never consciously accepted as authority, this is where fascination replaces suspicion. They stopped trying to disprove you. They started trying to understand you. And understanding, when it arrives too late, doesn't restore control. It only confirms how far control has already drifted. The room still looked the same. The hierarchy still kept its titles. The structures still stood, but everyone could feel it now. The center had shifted, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. And the most unsettling part for them wasn't that you were rising. It was that the rise felt like something that had already happened, and they were only just now catching up to the echo. By now, the silence around your name isn't empty. It's heavy. Conversations slow down when you're mentioned. Plans get revisited. Assumptions get double-checked. Not because you demanded influence, but because your presence quietly altered probability itself. That's what they don't know how to calculate. Influence that doesn't announce itself. Power that doesn't posture. Control that never shows its hand. You didn't arrive as a challenge. You arrived as a variable they forgot to account for. And once a variable is introduced into a closed system, nothing behaves the same again. They tried to isolate the source of the shift, looked for the speech that changed minds, the deal that tipped the balance, the moment that redefined direction. But there was no cinematic pivot, no dramatic reveal, just a consistent pattern of outcomes, bending in ways that favored alignment over force. That unsettles people more than rebellion ever could, because rebellion explains itself. This doesn't. They started replaying their own steps backward, searching for the point where your quiet decision intersected with their certainty. That's when doubt begins its real work. Not loud, not explosive, but precise. Cutting into confidence one thin layer at a time. You never took their spotlight. You simply made it irrelevant. They kept performing for an audience that had already shifted attention. The applause didn't stop, it just moved. And performers always feel that first. They sense it in the half-second delay before response. In the way energy doesn't mirror back the way it used to. In the subtle awareness that whatever they do next won't land the same way anymore. You didn't compete for the center. You changed where the center is. That's why their old strategies keep missing you. They're aiming at where power used to be. You're operating from where power is becoming. Some of them are beginning to realize that this wasn't sudden at all, that this rearrangement didn't happen overnight. It only feels abrupt because they weren't paying attention while it was forming. Quiet momentum always looks like surprise to those who confuse volume with movement. You planted outcomes long before they felt impact. And now that impact is everywhere. Decisions made in rooms you never entered. Outcomes shaped by values you never announced. Shifts justified by logic that quietly traces back to your original alignment. This is the stage where control slips through fingers without anyone being able to point to the moment it was lost. The levers are still there. The switches still exist. But the system responds differently now. It listens for a frequency they never learned to hear. And you've been speaking it fluently without ever raising your voice. And this is the part they struggle with the most. There was never a confrontation to remember. No clash of wills. No dramatic takeover. Nothing they can replay and say. That's where it happened. Because the truth is quieter than that. Control didn't get stolen. It expired. Their plan didn't get defeated. It got outpaced. While they were measuring challenges, you were refining timing. While they were tracking rivals, you were mastering alignment. While they were building defenses, you were simplifying decisions. That's why their systems still look intact on the surface. The reports still generate. The hierarchies still exist. The procedures still function. But the outcomes no longer belong to them in the way they expect. The results lean in your direction without asking permission. And nothing disturbs a control-based structure more than success. It didn't authorize. They thought power announces itself. You proved it migrates. They thought influence demands attention. You proved it redirects it. They thought dominance comes from pressure. You showed it comes from coherence. Now they're left trying to adapt to a version of reality that doesn't argue with them, doesn't resist them, doesn't even acknowledge their authority the way it used to. It simply moves past them. And that's the deepest disruption of all. Because when opposition challenges you, you feel powerful. But when progress bypasses you, you feel obsolete. You never needed to expose their flaws. Their own confusion does it for you. You never needed to claim the throne. The structure started orbiting you on its own. They're still analyzing charts, still running simulations, still asking experts how this could have happened without warning. None of those experts will be able to give the answer they're looking for, because the truth isn't technical. It's fundamental. You didn't change the game. You changed the axis it spins on. And now everything they built for a previous center has to relearn gravity. This is why they feel it everywhere and can name it nowhere. Why they sense the shift but can't locate the source. Why your presence rewrote their whole plan and they're still trying to process a reality that already moved on without waiting for their understanding.